Hi, Ire.
Hi.
So we talked a lot about accessibility. I think we covered a lot of things. So we'll also link to this previous video. So for people who want to make their websites more accessible, it would be like a very good resource. So thank you for that. One big topic also that you talk about a lot about is progressive enhancements and browser compatibility. Same thing. Can you explain like more or less what it is and like who is it for?
Okay, so progressive enhancements is, I guess, a way of building your sites. And it's the way you would do it is that you start off with building kind of a base level experience that gives the core functionality of whatever your website is to as many users as possible. And then you kind of build up on top of that by, I guess, progressively enhancing the experience and adding more and more modern features. So the concept is that you don't kind of break the experience for the, I guess, more lower level because that you're adding this new feature.
But still you provide like a very good experience for those who have like same devices as you, but just it's progressive.
Exactly. And like I said, the key thing is that you don't break the experience for the previous things. So like if you wanted to use Service Worker, for example, you wouldn't just go and say, Service Worker, like register Service Worker. You would first check, is Service Worker supported in the browser? Then you do it. So because you don't want to like just start doing something and then what if like the browser doesn't support it, then you've just completely broken the entire website. So
yeah. And does it mean like for all these questions about when to use JavaScript, and I know that lots of people are asking themselves, does it mean that you need to build first everything that you use, all the tools you have with HTML, then try to do things with CSS and then use JavaScript as a last resource? Or is it a bit different?
Yeah, so it's about, I wouldn't say like use JavaScript as a last resort, because I think when it comes to progressive enhancement, people tend to feel like, you're saying don't ever use JavaScript or any of that kind of stuff. It's just about using it where it's actually like appropriate and not using it where it's not appropriate. So trying to think of a particular example, but there are many things that you can do with just CSS and still having like a good accessible experience. So you don't necessarily need to use JavaScript for it. So maybe like animations, for example. A lot of animations can be done with CSS. And if it's possible to do it with CSS and it's still, like I said, accessible, then why not do it that way? And like I said, that's not to say that you should use CSS where JavaScript makes more sense. So for example, you see like a lot of people doing things like drop-down menus or interactive elements that it actually makes it a worse experience if you use CSS instead of using JavaScript. So we wouldn't say that we want that at all. So like I said, you use JavaScript where it makes sense, and particularly with accessibility, you really do need JavaScript, right? If you want to, if for example you absolutely need to rebuild the button element for some reason, which is almost never there's almost never a good reason to do it. But okay, an example that people may need to do is the select element, right? Because maybe you do actually need to enhance it in a certain way. So you need to rebuild it from the ground up. I would not suggest that you try and do that with CSS only, because you're probably going to end up with something that doesn't function correctly. So with something like that, you actually need to make use of JavaScript to have that, to like make it more accessible, because like I said, you need to be able to respond to different like keyboard interactions and all of that. So a good example of progressive enhancement in that would be to start with the native select elements, right? And for people who do have JavaScript enabled, then you can enhance that by having like the more fully featured select element.
So like basically you have some kind of different cases or different fallbacks in case of like they don't support this JavaScript, for instance. It's not very clear for me, at least, like what are the different things that I should check. Is it not like, for instance, JavaScript, it's like something that's pretty obvious, everyone is talking about it, you need maybe, or the browser won't support it at that point. But how can I know what are the things I need to check and for which I need to like put fallbacks?
Okay, interesting. Well, the way I see it is that the most accessible thing in the world is just plain HTML, right? So I don't know. First of all, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but there's a website called Mother Effing Website. And if you go to it, it just says, this is a Mother Effing website. And like, it's very accessible. It's responsive by default because it's basically just HTML. So I think if you start with that experience, okay, so you know the base level experience is basically just HTML, right? If you start with that, then everything else you build on top of it, know that it's possible that it might not be there.
Okay.
So for example, I mean, it's an extreme example, but I think like I have a friend, he builds his website and he writes out the entire HTML first and doesn't even do anything with CSS. And then it's like, oh, okay, does this document still make sense the way it's written?
Okay.
And then it starts building with CSS. Like, I don't know how he does that because I can't build that way, but I still like, I go back and forth between HTML and CSS, but at the same time, I know that if that style sheet is not loaded,
okay, you see,
it still makes sense. Okay. And that's not to say that it should be, that's what you're optimizing for in any way. All I'm saying is that that should still like make sense. You shouldn't have a case where your footer is actually the first element in the HTML and you're using flex something to like make it go to the bottom. Like, there's like, why would you do that, right? So it's like you start from that and then you kind of build up on top of it. So I would say anything you're adding, you should think, okay, what if it's not actually here? Okay. And obviously the amount of importance you put on it also depends on what website you're making and what use case you're looking at. Yeah. So the example I give is that when I was working at the media company in Nigeria, we found out that so many of our users were using Opera Mini. So then it became very important for me to actually know what features, like I know so much knowledge about about what works in Opera Mini that it's like insane. And so everything I was thinking about was like, oh wait, is it going to work in this? And I need to go and check. So now, like, even if you look at the Bitcoins, the main website, or the first website anyway, it like still works in Opera Mini, even though that the main application isn't going to work. But at least that first, I thought it was very important that if someone goes to buycoins.africa, they can see that, and it will work, even if they can't sign up and stuff, because obviously that required a bit more. So, I think I lost track of what I was saying, but yeah. You
were saying that, okay, so it needs, but just this leads me to something else, browser support. Yeah. So you realized that you need to support Opera Mini. But how did you realize it? Like, most people don't even know which browser people use on their website, and maybe they have a lot of people they lose because they don't support a browser, but they don't know it. So how did you like figure out that you need to support Opera Mini?
Yeah.
And like, how did you see like all of the things that you need to like optimize for to be able to have it like have a website that is understandable and working more or less for that browser?
Yeah, so Google Analytics basically is the answer. Okay. And I was actually just doing this with our sites, the Bitcoin sites, yesterday or something, just to like check again. And basically, it just allows you to actually dive in. It will even tell you the browser versions people are on. So you can say, okay, everyone is using Chrome, and you might feel like, okay, that's good. But what version of Chrome are they on? Like, maybe they're on like 50 or something crazy like that, which is very unlikely. But I think whenever, especially if it's a business you're working on, you have to have some sort of analytics package. It doesn't have to be Google Analytics, it can be anything, but something that will tell you what devices and what browsers people are using, because that will allow you to tailor the experience. And like I said, it's not about, you don't have to make the site work for 100% of people on the planet, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to have a target market. Yeah. So you should focus on those people. So I think you need to start from there. I mean, you can make the best experience as you possibly can, but having the data is what's going to tell you where you should really be focusing on. Okay,
and then what you do is that you try this browser and see like how your website looks on this browser, or like would you go to like somewhere and see like what is supported in the browser and make sure you use it, and what's not supported is like you have a fallback for it? Yeah,
I mean, I would say it's a combination of both. So for me, when I realized people were using Opera Mini. First of all, I didn't know what that was at first. I was like, what the hell is this browser? So then I downloaded it, and then it was like the biggest shock of my life. It's like, what the hell is this? And why is absolutely everything broken? I think like when I opened it up, it was mostly just like a blank white screen, and then maybe like the logo. And I was like, everything else was not even there. I was like, wow, this is really, really broken. And then, so you start from there. I think just first of all, opening it up in the browser will give you a sense of how good or bad things are. And then you can now dive in and go in and see like, okay, I'm using this particular feature. And then that's where tools like caniuse.com are really useful, because they can tell you specifically this particular feature, what is supported, what isn't. And you can also, what's great with them, which I haven't actually used myself, but I think you can plug in your Google Analytics data, so it can give you a percentage of, okay, I want to use feature queries. How many browsers of my users, what percent of my users will this actually support? So
that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Cool. And also about like the performance, can you like test for different like network quality how your website will behave? Is it something that we can do?
Yeah, so I think this is in pretty much all browsers now. You can, in your developer tools, well, I know how it works in Chrome because that's what I use most of the time. But under the network panel, you can simulate different devices or different network connections, rather. And you can even like customize it and create your own specific like download or upload speeds. So if you know this is specifically the average for this person, then you can do that. So that's something I also try and do frequently, because I think for all of us as developers, there's a huge imbalance in the devices and the network that we're using, especially in our jobs, because we're like in places where they're like paying for the fastest internet. But then when we go to like a friend's house or something, you see that it's like completely different. And speed is so important. Like having things take seconds to load is like a huge problem. And I think there was a statistic that said something like, if your page takes more than 3 seconds to load, like it drops off by like 50% or something of users just like close it because they're like, they can't even do this.
Or they will never come back.
Yeah, exactly. They're just like, your site is down, or it's like not working, and they just leave. So having that initial first paint or all of those things are really important. And that's why I think Jamstack is really great, because they're just serving you an HTML file like that doesn't need an entire however megabyte large JavaScript file to load anything. It's just like, this is it, and they're like really, really performant.
And also like, so this also, the thing about like performance and like how fast you can load your website is something that I found like you work a lot on. Also like how can you load the CSS, and how can you like make also like load it maybe in advance for some pages when you have Wi-Fi or when you have like a good network. And so how can people like implement this kind of progressive CSS like loading? I don't know how is that the word, or like
I would say, I guess preloading it might be what you're talking about. But yeah, there are many different ways to kind of optimize CSS, because when people talk about CSS, they always say it's like render blocking, which just means that if you're linking to a CSS file, like in your head, for example, the browser needs to fetch all of that, parse all of it. No matter what is displayed on the page, it's going to parse everything in that file, and then it's going to create what is going to be rendered on the page. So ideally, what you want is the smallest CSS file possible. And that's why techniques like doing inline critical CSS are important. And what that basically is instead of linking to your huge CSS file, you can just have the what's called critical CSS actually inlined in the page. And that's just whatever, hopefully small amounts of CSS is needed to just display that first hero image or whatever it is that's like right there. And then after the page has actually been loaded, then you can fetch the full style sheet that has everything. And another thing that you can do is splitting up the CSS based on the media type. So I think that's like a really great way to really like minimize your file sizes, because we usually have like so many different media queries in the same style sheets. We're having styles for desktop and for mobile, when really we should only be loading one of those. So what we can do is, instead of linking to one giant style sheet, we can have different style sheets, one for desktop, one for mobile, and
then you only load the one that you need.
Yeah.
And also like something that we talked about in with David. He was there in .css as well. He told me that for instance, animations, you don't need actually like animations that can be blocking when they're really like big or like heavy. So he only uses, I guess, opacity and transform for his animation. Is this something that you do as well?
Yeah. So with animations, it can be one of the things that, like you said, is just really, it slows your website down a lot. And that's because you're animating the wrong type of property. And it's like, I guess it's a bit long or complicated to explain, but basically, like I mentioned, when the browser gets like the HTML document and it's trying to go from, okay, here's the HTML document, to displaying everything on the page, there are like many different stages it has to go through. And if you're animating certain properties, you're kind of taking it back and saying, okay, redo all of this. So but then if you're animating the transform or the opacity, I think also the filter property, those are the best, because they don't take the browser as far back as possible. It's just redoing the last stage as opposed to redoing the last like 3 or 4 stages. Yeah.
So you won't like require that much work from the browser. So in terms of performance, it will be like faster.
Exactly. So animating things like the top property, for example, is like probably the worst you can ever do. So I would say just stick with like transform. And what I found is like, when you're trying to animate stuff, transform is really like probably the most important thing, because you can move things,
That's
you can
exactly
like
what I
turn
learned,
things
yes.
around. It's basically everything you want to do. And then you can use opacity for taking things like making things visible and taking things out of visibility.
So basically you can do pretty much everything with these two. Sometimes it's a bit harder. He told me like if you want to make elements like turn, it's a bit harder than like if you just want to move like in a linear way. But still I guess you have resources to like do different like transformations or animations for all of this. And
I think for like 99% of the use cases, you're just trying to move things from here to here. You're not really trying to do crazy 3D animations. And I think if you're getting to that stage, you might as well use a different tool. And that's where maybe JavaScript might even be better for you to do. And you can do stuff with like the canvas and things like that. But if you're just doing a simple, okay, when I click this, just move it there, then I think using transform is like best.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you. That was super interesting.